politicking have allowed 32,000 people, 10,000 of them in New York City, to develop a fatal illness. Vito urged GMHC, Gay Men's Health Crisis, to, quote, take a chance on offending someone, somewhere, sometime, by raising its voice to governmental institutions that were allowing thousands to die by not facilitating drug research. I have to digress here for 1 second. 1987, we're 6 years into Ronald Reagan's presidency. At the time that Vito wrote these words, Ronald Reagan had yet to mention the word AIDS in public even once. Thousands and thousands and thousands of Americans had died of AIDS on Reagan's watch, never mentioning that AIDS existed. This is part of what's fueling Vito's rage here. To remain silent in the face of such negligence was unconscionable. In parting shot, Vito raged, "We're exhausted, and we're threatened with death, darlings. Where the hell are you? Waiting online to get into the new Bette Midler movie? Get your asses into the streets." He published this in the New York Native, which was the main New York gay newspaper at the time, and this had a big effect. And 3 weeks after this letter was published, Larry Kramer spoke at the Lesbian and Gay Community Center down on West 13th Street and gave the speech that really became the beginning of ACT UP, and I'd like to read you a little bit about that. After announcing the current number of AIDS cases, Larry directed 2/3 of the audience to rise. "At the rate we're going, you could be dead in less than 5 years, he told those standing. When, Larry demanded, would the gay lesbian community flex its political muscle and force the National Institutes of Health to stop giving placebos to so many drug trial patients, force the Food and Drug Administration to approve such possibly helpful drugs as ribavirin and AL-721? When would the government get the message that gays were willing to be guinea pigs and test promising medications? Give us the fucking drugs," Larry shouted. This led into ACT UP's first demonstration, which was on March 24th, 1987, on Wall Street, which was targeted specifically as a way to protest the pharmaceutical company Burroughs Wellcome, which produced AZT, the only drug that was approved at the time, to say this price tag that you put on AZT of $10,000 is simply unacceptable. And just a little description about that demo. At a bitter 7:55 a.m. on March 24th, Vito sat in the middle of Broadway and looked around him at the signs that swarmed around him proclaiming AZT the great pacifier and querying President Reagan, who had yet to mention AIDS publicly, "Your son is gay. Aren't you worried about him?" Others carried oversized dollar bills stamped with George Washington's likeness on one side and the slogan, "Fuck your profiteering," on the other. Reams of AIDS fact sheets and copies of Larry's recent New York Times op-ed piece, "The FDA's Callous Response to AIDS," were distributed to spectators. Before the gates of Trinity Church, ACT UP hung an effigy of FDA Commissioner Frank Young, donated by Joseph Papp of the Public Theater, where Larry Kramer's play The Normal Heart had debuted 2 years earlier. When the demo wrapped, protesters chorused to onlookers, "This is just the beginning," and they were right. ACT UP had just begun a decade of the world's most visible, imaginative, and controversial AIDS activism. In May, the group selected a slogan that permanently epitomized its philosophy: silence equals death. The Grand Fury Art Collective poised these iconic words in white capital letters against a black background and under a pink triangle, the symbol that Nazis had forced homosexual men to wear in the concentration camps. This stark image began appearing on shirts and signs around the country. ACT UP was Vito's last hurrah as an activist, and he really became ACT UP's most beloved figure. Larry Kramer was the founder of it, really the main founder of ACT UP, but Larry Kramer had an enormously angry persona that put a lot of people off. Vito had the same kind of anger, but was so approachable and accessible and beloved because of the cellular closet that he was able to invite people in. A year after ACT UP was founded in October of 1988, ACT UP did a major demonstration at the Food and Drug Administration in Washington. And the day before that demonstration, Vito gave his most famous speech, which I would like to play for you in its entirety because if anything epitomizes who and what Vito Russo was, this is it.
Members of my family who get all their information from reading the newspapers and watching television know two things about me. They know that I'm going to die, and that the FDA and the government is doing everything in their power to save my life. I think they've been lied to. If I'm dying of anything, it's from homophobia. If I'm dying of anything, it's from racism. If I'm dying from anything, it's from indifference and red tape. If I'm dying from anything, I'm dying from Jesse Helms. If I'm dying from anything, I'm dying from that moron who calls himself the President of the United States. If I'm dying from anything, I'm dying from the sensationalism of newspapers and magazines and television shows, which are interested in me as a human interest story as long as I'm willing to be a helpless victim, but not if I'm fighting for my life. If I'm dying from anything, it's not from opportunistic infections, it's from opportunistic politicians. And opportunistic crazies on the right and the left who are using AIDS to push their bullshit ideology by exploiting my movement. If I'm dying from anything, I'm dying from the fact that not enough rich, white, heterosexual men have gotten AIDS for anybody to give a shit. Living with AIDS in this country is like living in the Twilight Zone. Living with AIDS is living through a war which is happening only to those people who are in the trenches. Every time a shell explodes, you look around and you discover that you've lost more of your friends. But nobody else notices. It isn't happening to them. They're walking the streets as though we weren't living through some sort of a hideous nightmare. Only you can hear people screaming and dying and crying for help. No one else seems to be noticing. Only it's worse than wartime, because during a war the people are united in a shared experience. This war has not united us, it's divided us. It's separated those of us with AIDS and those of us who fight for people with AIDS from the rest of the population. The media tells people they don't have to care because the citizens who really matter are in no danger. Twice, 3 times, maybe 4 times, the New York Times has published editorials saying, "Don't panic yet over AIDS. It still hasn't entered the general population. And until it does, we don't have to give a shit." And the days and the months and the years go by, and they don't have to spend those days and nights and months and years trying to figure out how to get a hold of the latest experimental drug, and which dose to take, and in what combination with other drugs, and where do you get it, and for how much money, because it isn't happening to them, so they don't give a shit. And they don't sit on television stages, in studios, surrounded by technicians wearing rubber gloves, and refusing to put body mics on people because it isn't happening to them, so they don't give a shit. And they don't have their houses burned down by bigots and morons. They only watch it on the news, and then they go and eat dinner, and they go to bed because it isn't happening to them, so they don't give a shit. They don't spend their waking hours going from one hospital to another, watching the people they love die slowly of bigotry and neglect because it isn't happening to them, so they don't give a shit. They haven't been to 2 funerals a week for the last 3 or 4 or 5 years. They don't give a shit because it's not happening to them, meaning that it isn't happening to the real people, the world-famous general public we all keep hearing about. Legionnaire's disease was happening to them because it hit people who looked like them, who sounded like them, who were the same color as them. And that story about a couple of dozen people hit the front pages of every newspaper and magazine in this country, and it stayed there until the mystery was over. All I read in the newspapers tells me that the mainstream heterosexual population is not at risk for this disease. All the newspapers I read tell me that IV drug users and homosexuals still account for the overwhelming majority of cases and those at risk. AIDS is a test of who we are as a people.